we're ready to start, and now we'll start. So welcome to today's video conference, the 15th in our series of weekly briefings to help reporters track the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial and economic inequities it is exposing and exacerbating in our country. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Today, our focus is on what many experts predict will be a tsunami of evictions nationwide over coming months, as millions of laid-off workers are unable to pay rent and eviction moratoriums are set to expire by the end of July. On behalf of EMS, I want to extend our thanks to Blue Shield of California Foundation and the California Healthcare Foundation for their support of this initiative. A special thanks also to today's speakers and to veteran reporters Pilar Marrero and Sunita Sarabji for coordinating the project. A special thanks also to all of you, our colleagues in the media sector who regularly cover these conferences. A note to our regulars, Dr. Tung Nguyen is unable to join today's conference with his weekly update on the pandemic. He's become an indispensable resource for us, and we look forward to his summaries on future calls. Jessica Martin will now offer instructions on how to enter questions for the speakers in our chat box. We will be inviting questions at the conclusion of each speaker.
Them if that's better. Go for it. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. And I can send slides as a follow-up to everyone who's listening if that would be helpful, so you have the data readily available.
Perfect.
So, great. To begin, at a time when sheltering in place is paramount to stabilizing the United States and controlling the pandemic, our country is on the brink of a housing crisis of unprecedented magnitude and with no safety net beneath us. COVID-19 struck at a time when we were already at a housing crisis. 20.5 million families struggled to scrape the rent together, and only 1 in 4, so 25% of eligible renters actually received federal financial assistance, and they were eligible. That means that many people did not qualify for or did not receive housing subsidies even though they were qualified. So between the scarcity of federal housing assistance and the loss of 4 million affordable housing units over the last decade, renters were increasingly vulnerable to eviction coming into the pandemic. To put this in perspective, 7 evictions were filed every minute in 2016. That was when the average national unemployment rate was 4.7%. Today, as you know, unemployment is nearly 4 times that level and expected to keep fluctuating upwards. So why can we expect eviction to increase? Underscoring the immense toll of the pandemic, 50 million renters today live in households that suffered COVID-19 related job loss or income loss. And 40% of that occurred in especially low income households. In addition, the demand for financial assistance is at an all-time high. There was a 92% increase in daily rental assistance requests from this time last year, and programs are being exhausted within minutes of being opened for rental assistance. In addition, food pantry requests have increased by as much as 2,000% in some states. So this demonstrates that renters are really stretched to pay the rent first, and other things are being set aside like food, necessities, healthcare, and otherwise. Renters are also taking on credit card and loan debt just to make ends meet and pay the rent. A new analysis of the US Census House Pulse Survey by Stout, Reeses, and Ross that came out today estimates that approximately 16.9 million households, many of which contain numerous adults and children, are unable to pay the rent and at risk of eviction. Another study by the Aspen Institute found that 20 to 24 million renters will be facing eviction by the end of September. So again, to put this in perspective, 10 million people were displaced from their homes over a course of years following the foreclosure crisis of 2008. We are on track to surpass that number in just 4 months. Renters of color, especially Black and Latinx renters, are at the highest risk. These populations have experienced COVID-19 job loss, infection, and death at much higher rates than other demographics, and they consistently report low confidence in their ability to pay the rent during this pandemic. The steep decline in rent payments will also have a devastating impact across the housing market, especially among small property owners who lack the financial ability to sustain short and long-term non-payment of rent. Individual investors, so small property owners, own approximately 22.7 million out of the 48.5 million rental units in the country. The Harvard University Joint Center on Housing Studies estimates that 20% of renters in these units may have difficulty paying the rent. These are the types of units that we will lose in the housing market, that will decrease affordable housing and end up crippling that entire system, depleting it as well. In response to the increasing risk of eviction, state and local governments issued moratoriums, and the federal government passed the CARES Act, which created a moratorium on federally assisted housing and also had temporary unemployment insurance. These prevented widespread eviction between March and July, but these are also expiring at the end of July, along with the majority of state-issued moratoriums. And this is before states have developed and implemented strategies to really support property owners and renters to weather this storm. So today, less than half of the states have a state-level eviction moratorium, and 29 states received less than 1 out of 5 stars on the Housing Policy Scorecard that I created with the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. This means that evictions that were on hold will be executed and new evictions will be filed. Michigan's moratorium, for example, expired this week, and they expect 80,000 eviction filings now. The majority of courts have moved to remote hearings, which also raises questions about a tenant's ability to exercise their right to be heard. Between the technology divide, the lack of minutes on their phone, the ability to pay for their phone or access a computer when they can't pay the rent, as well as language barriers and others, create significant due process concerns. So what does this mean for renters and for society? Well, eviction has negative consequences that result in high community and healthcare expenditures. Just the notice of eviction can increase rates of stress, anxiety, and depression. Renters with eviction filings on their record are often blocked out of the renter market by landlords, even if they ultimately won their case. Eviction results in failing credit scores. It forces families into rental housing with substandard conditions that pose a threat to their health and safety. And it almost always leads to a downward move to rundown housing, to disadvantaged higher crime neighborhoods, homelessness, academic decline. No good outcome from eviction. And these outcomes cost communities and taxpayers far more than the price of addressing the affordable housing crisis itself. In places like California, the risk of eviction has resulted in a rise in the creation of unions. Renters have started to protest, demanding cancel the rent or rent relief. And the formation of these tenant unions in buildings and communities was designed to really organize and increase tenant bargaining power. They have had early successes, including rent control ordinances. Ultimately, the pandemic magnified and heightened the socioeconomic divide and the health and racial disparities, and shredded the already threadbare safety net in America. State leaders, federal leaders have an unparalleled opportunity to address these outcomes and their root causes, to ensure that the new post-pandemic reality is one in which health justice, racial justice, and housing justice are realized. And I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Emily. Could I start with a question for you? When we briefed, you had some demographic data on populations that are particularly vulnerable to eviction. I wonder if you could share some of your findings with us.
The demographic data related to minorities who are facing eviction?
Exactly.
Yes. So some of the statistics have demonstrated that there's a disproportionate impact on, many of the studies have demonstrated that there's a disproportionate impact on Black and Latinx renters who have experienced COVID-19 job or wage loss at much higher rates. In fact, Black renters experienced it at 44% and Hispanic at 61%, whereas white households were only a fraction of that at 38%. In addition, they also demonstrate a lack of emergency funds to cover 3 months of expenses. Nearly 75% of Black and Latino renters said that they did not have those emergency funds over 3 months, as compared to only 47% of white renters. And these trends have continued throughout the pandemic. And this is largely due to a longstanding loss of wealth and wealth accumulation and affordable housing throughout our history, especially due to discriminatory zoning laws and other policies that have really blocked communities of color out of that kind of forward movement. And they also lost all of the gains that they made in homeownership and other areas due to predatory lending and other outcomes of the 2008 foreclosure crisis.
Thank you. Henrietta Burrows has a very important question for you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarita. I am just wondering, in terms of those evicted, where will they be going, given the number of evictions that you're talking about? And also, given the market at this time, do the rental owners expect that they will be able to get tenants who can pay higher rents? Or will a lot of the apartments, rental places go vacant?
That's such a great question. So eviction often leads to housing instability and homelessness. And so families rarely are able to locate equal living situations. So they end up doubled up in overcrowded settings or in homeless shelters. And all of these are places where people cannot safely social distance, where there just isn't the space to do that. And we know that COVID-19, the risk of COVID-19 is related to contact. So the inability to social distance, to safely shelter in place, could expose families who are evicted to COVID-19 at higher rates and really spur an increase in that contraction rate. In terms of the property owners, so many of the property owners who will be affected by non-payment of rent are small property owners who don't have the financial cushion to wait for a new renter. And so what may happen is that the housing market itself will be depleted, and these units will actually be taken off the market or repurposed for something else, as opposed to being re-rented by a different tenant.
Interesting. Emily, thank you so much. Your comments are hugely informative.
Could I ask,
yes.
There's so many questions, this great opening address, but are there states that you see that are particularly hit hard that we should have on our radar? And are there states that are ahead of the curve, or even local areas ahead of the curve in addressing this? We have a national media audience.
Great. So the states that I'm really concerned about are the ones that have reported high levels of insecurity, so inability to pay their rent, and combined with very limited protections against eviction. So the moratoriums have already been lifted or expired, and the renters were already facing rent burden. So the states, a lot of the southern states fall into that category. I'm particularly concerned about Florida and Mississippi and Texas and those regions. Others are ones that you may not see a backlog of eviction filings right now because they accepted evictions and processed them and executed them throughout the pandemic. So states like Missouri or Ohio are very concerning because their housing instability and the population affected by that has been increasing this entire time. So those are states that I'm especially concerned about. But truly, this issue is touching every corner of the country. No one has been spared from the economic depression and the result that has, the effect that has on housing and the subsequent impacts. So the states that have very little safety net in place for populations will have a very challenging time recovering from this, and will feel the effects through the societal costs and the impact to our communities.
Emily, thank you once again for your very insightful comments. I would like to next introduce Delegate Kumar Barve. Mr. Barve and his fellow legislators wrote a letter to Governor Larry Hogan asking to extend the state's eviction moratorium to January